I now have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Honorable Kamina Johnson-Smith, Senator, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Jamaica, to introduce the report. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present Jamaica's third cycle report to this working group session of the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Our delegation to this review includes representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, the Ministry of Justice and the Attorney General's chambers, all participating from Capital, as well as the permanent representative and staff of our permanent mission to the Office of the United Nations in Geneva. Mr. Vice President, please allow me, in the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, to highlight Jamaica's long and cherished history as a member of this august body, actively participating in support of the promotion and protection of human rights. It was in 1963, as a newly independent nation, that at the General Assembly, Jamaica initiated and advocated for focused attention to defining an international human rights landscape with agreed principles guaranteeing fundamental freedoms and rights for all peoples. We're therefore proud of our contribution to the international human rights architecture over the decades. The Jamaican Constitution guarantees all our citizens the protection of their rights regardless of color, class, creed, or sex. In fact, in 2011, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms replaced Chapter 3 of the Constitution and expanded our rights. The Charter enshrines fundamental rights and freedoms. Significantly, the Charter applies to the state and also between individual citizens. It therefore inculcates respect for human rights at all levels of society by holding all persons, including the state, accountable. Let me therefore reiterate the high importance which Jamaica attaches to this review exercise. Mr. Vice President, we are proud that Jamaica is ranked number 6 in the world and remains number 1 in the Western Hemisphere with respect to press freedom, according to the 2020 Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index. In fact, Jamaica has, since 2016, been consistently ranked among the top 10 countries in the world for press freedom. This high ranking underscores our foundation as a country that respects and upholds the rights of our fourth estate, which underpins our democracy and further strengthens democratic accountability and the protection of human rights at the national level. Having regard to the national context, let me state the following. Our participation today is particularly significant in a context where we continue to grapple with the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. This has exacerbated many of our socio-economic development challenges and further threatens to impede the efforts which are underway at the national and global levels to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, the strengthening of the nexus between health, economic development, and human rights is now a part of our reality, as it is that of the entire world. Prior to the pandemic, Jamaica's reform program to stabilize the economy, reduce debt, and fuel economic growth and job creation had begun to reap significant benefits. For the first time in almost 20 years, public debt fell below 100% of GDP. It was on track to decline below 60% by 2025. The rate of unemployment also fell to a historic low of 7.2% in October 2019. Almost half the rate at the start of the reform program. The gender unemployment gap was also closed significantly. However, the economy is now expected to contract by more than 5%, and unemployment has already risen. Furthermore, government revenues are estimated to decline by double digits, even as expenditure needs rise to meet emergency health services, as well as social and economic support. Nevertheless, the government of Jamaica continues its journey on the path of national transformation through Jamaica's 2009 National Development Plan, Vision 2030, which is fully aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals of the globally agreed Agenda 2030.
Hello, I'm Dr. Carlton Bird, Speaker Director for Breath of Life Television Ministries, and I want to encourage you to watch Breath of Life right here on PBCJ.
The point of wearing a mask is to prevent the spread of air droplets from persons who may or may not be infected. When wearing a mask, please ensure that the mask goes above the nose and below the chin. This might be a bit uncomfortable, but it's for your own safety. The position of the mask is very important. It should not be worn on your forehead, under your chin, or on your neck. Please do not remove the mask when speaking. This actually causes more droplets to be released into the atmosphere. Trust me, if you have on a mask, we will still hear you. When you're removing a mask, try not to touch the front of the mask. If you do, remember to wash your hands or use hand sanitizer. Please throw away the mask appropriately. Remember, partial protection is better than no protection.
Watch yourself online, that's what my crew say. Make it a new day. I'm reminded by the Broadcasting Commission. We the BCJ. What if it was your friend in the mix? What if it was your sis in the pics? What if you want a terrorist watch list? What if?
Suppose that go on. What you da do?
Don't like, don't comment, don't click. Report it, block it, don't make it stick. Don't trust everybody on the internet. Use it to step up your intellect. So online you have to be safe too. Don't believe the rumors or the fake news. Don't go everywhere they try to take you. Protect the kids or they find a way through. What if it was your friend in the mix? What if it was your sis in the pics? What if you want a terrorist watch list? What if?
Suppose that go on.
What if?
Wait up, free.
What if they knew that you abused her? Her family?
Mr. Jones.
And your colleagues, how will they look at an abuser? When the law comes knocking, you'll have nowhere to run.
Mr. Brown, you're under arrest. Please get up, hands behind your head and interlock your fingers.
Turn your back on abusers. Report gender-based violence to the police. There's no excuse for abuse. Call the Bureau of Gender Affairs at 876-754-8577.
This is what you've been waiting for.
WebEx right now. We will get back to you as soon as this problem is fixed. And thank you for your patience.
This is what you've been waiting for. A chance to change your point of view and take the break you deserve at Jamaica's resorts and attractions. When you can open your door to the seaside instead of just outside. Where you can change your mask and take a plunge.
Sunshine smiling warm up inside your heart. Feeling of pure love. Oh, Jamaican heartbeat. Dancing to the beat. Up inside your heart. Whoa. Heartbeat of the world. Oh, Jamaican heartbeat.
Contact your travel agent today to book your staycation. RediscoverJamaica.com.
No one is immune to mental illness. Your age, race, gender, social class, or economic status is no match for addictive behaviors, anxiety or eating disorders, depression, or schizophrenia. What is
And please be remembered that the use of the word recommended or recommendation will ensure that the relevant part of your statements are included in the recommendation section of the working group report. And I now refer to the list of speakers, and I will give the floor to Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. Ghana warmly welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to the UPR working group. We commend the steps taken by the government since their last UPR to promote and protect human rights in the country, including the adoption and implementation of the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence from 2017 to 2027, as well as the commencement of the implementation of the National Poverty Reduction Program of 2018. We also note the ratification of the Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers in 2016. To further strengthen human rights promotion and protection in Jamaica, my delegation wishes to make the following recommendations. 1. Continue its efforts to promptly accede to the International Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment and its optional protocol. 2. Intensify its efforts to combat crime, violence, and human trafficking and address its high global rates on homicide. And lastly, continue efforts to strengthen measures to foster training and awareness of public officials, including the security forces, on relevant human rights issues. My delegation wishes Jamaica every success with the UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. Greece welcomes the Jamaican delegation to the UPR. We recognize the progress achieved since the last review, notably through the 10-year National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence and the launch and implementation of the Spotlight Initiative against family violence. We look forward to the review of the Offences Against the Person Act, and in particular to the removal of existing restrictive conditions to determining marital rape. Greece recommends that Jamaica 1. Continue its efforts towards eliminating domestic and gender-based violence. 2. Remove the existing restrictive conditions to determining marital rape in the Offences Against the Person Act. And 3. Step up its efforts to protect all citizens from violence and discrimination, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons. Greece wishes the Jamaican delegation every success in implementing the recommendations received today. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Haiti. Guyana, okay. Sorry, I'll give the floor to Guyana first.
Thank you, Madam President. Guyana welcomes the delegation of Jamaica, a sister CARICOM nation, and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. We applaud the progress achieved in the promotion and protection of human rights within the framework of the Vision 2030 Jamaica National Development Plan. We congratulate Jamaica on its comprehensive response to recommendations received during its second cycle UPR, and welcome the establishment of the Interministerial Committee on Human Rights as the official national entity for reporting and follow-up with UN human rights mechanisms. We note that the establishment of a national human rights institution remains an objective of the government, and that efforts have been made to engage national stakeholders to determine the right approach for the country. We urge the government to continue in its efforts to establish an NHRI and respectfully recommend that Jamaica continue to engage with national stakeholders and UN agencies to address outstanding treaty body reports. We wish Jamaica a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Haiti.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Vice President. Haiti bids a cordial welcome to the Jamaican delegation, our brother country from CARICOM, as it undertakes its third UPR. We recognise Jamaica's will to cooperate with the UPR despite the serious disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Haiti takes notes of efforts deployed by the Jamaican authorities to improve living conditions of all communities. And we also commend the measures taken to fight poverty, reduce inequality and implement the National Development Plan, Vision 2030. In a constructive spirit, we have the following two recommendations for the Jamaican authorities. One, to use economic and social policies to support the family institution and to conserve family values. And two, to take sustainable and lasting tangible measures to fight the adversities of climate change, particularly in the tourism industry. Haiti wishes Jamaica every success in implementing accepted recommendations.
To Honduras.
Señora Presidenta.
Vice President, the Honduran delegation welcomes the Jamaican delegation and thanks it for its report. In spirit of cooperation, the constructive approach which epitomizes this mechanism, we have the following recommendations. One is to sign and ratify the Convention Against Torture. Two, to sign and ratify the International Convention to Protect All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. And three, to adopt domestic legislation to fight discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Honduras congratulates you on progress and achievements in implementing recommendations received in previous cycles, particularly for having acceded to the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction in 2017. We reiterate our support for all Jamaica's actions to effectively implement recommendations received in this and previous cycles.
And I'll give the floor to Iceland.
Thank you, Madam President. Iceland welcomes the delegation of Jamaica, welcomes the national report and the steps outlined therein, and hope for the continued implementation. Iceland makes the following recommendations. 1. Fully abolish the death penalty and ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. 2. Adopt and implement legislation prohibiting corporal punishment in all settings, including at home. 3. Decriminalize consensual sexual relations between adults of the same sex and expand its anti-discrimination legislation to include a prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. 4. Provide guidance, including setting standards when necessary, and sensitize health professionals, health service providers, security forces and legal operators to provide services with dignity and respect for all populations, including LGBTI persons. I wish Jamaica all success for this review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to India.
Madam President, India extends a very warm welcome to the delegation of Jamaica and thanks the delegation for their presentation. We commend Jamaica's continued cooperation with the UN human rights mechanisms and note with appreciation its submission of reports to CRPD, the CEDAW, and the Beijing Platform for Action plus 25 in 2019-2020. Jamaica's efforts at focusing on standardization of the curriculum, enhancing the framework and systems for assessment from the early childhood to secondary levels are praiseworthy. We take note with appreciation of Vision 2030, Jamaica's National Development Plan, and a National Policy on Poverty and National Policy Poverty Reduction Program 2017. We also commend Jamaica's efforts in focusing climate change mitigation measures through renewable energy and energy efficient investments. In the spirit of constructive cooperation, India makes the following recommendations to Jamaica. First, consider establishing an independent national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. Second, develop programs on awareness raising to law enforcement authorities and judicial officers on human rights values and principles. Third, take necessary measures to combat discriminatory practices against women and girls, including gender-based violence. And fourth, continue to take measures towards implementing the legislative protection to the persons with disabilities. We wish the delegation of Jamaica all success in its future endeavors. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. Indonesia thanks the delegation of Jamaica for presenting their national report. Indonesia welcomes the improvement by the government of Jamaica in advancing women's rights and gender equity, as reflected in the increase of women representation in the government and the progress made by relevant institutions tasked with promoting the gender mainstreaming agenda. Indonesia wishes to offer the following recommendations. 1. To continue to work towards the establishment of a national human rights institution based on the Paris Principles, including through possible bilateral and regional exchanges with other countries. 2. To strengthen training for law enforcement officials, focusing on de-escalation and prevention of situations in which there may be a need to use force, as well as to consider acceding to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And 3. To continue addressing the identified challenges to sustainable development through providing better supports toward the respect of human rights, including in the maritime sector, relating to human trafficking, slavery, and other human rights abuses in the seafaring and fisheries industries. We wish Jamaica a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Iran.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation thanks the delegation of Jamaica for presenting its national report and constructive engagement in UPR process. We commend Jamaica for its efforts for promotion and protection of human rights. The Islamic Republic of Iran submits the following recommendations to the government of Jamaica. 1. While we welcome the adoption of national policy on poverty and national poverty reduction program by the government of Jamaica, we recommend Jamaica to maximize its efforts to reduce poverty, in particular through taking effective measures to support groups in vulnerable situations such as women, persons with disabilities, and homeless population. 2. To improve infrastructure to protect and support the rights and needs of persons with disabilities in public settings. 3. To take further actions to full and effective implementation of the National Education Strategic Plan. We wish Jamaica a successful review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Iraq.
No. Thank you. We welcome the delegation of Jamaica and wish to submit the following recommendations. 1. Establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 2. Enhance gender equality and women's participation in decision-making roles in the political and public life. Thirdly, pursue efforts aimed at combating racism and xenophobia and prosecute perpetrators as well as provide assistance to victims. Mr. Vice President, Iraq welcomes the efforts made by Jamaica to combat poverty and implement the National Plan for Human Development 2030. We call on it to pursue efforts to fight trafficking in children for sexual exploitation and forced labor. In conclusion, we wish Jamaica all success in this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Ireland.
Ireland warmly welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and thanks them for their presentation today. Ireland acknowledges Jamaica's efforts to advance human rights domestically and commends progress made since the last UPR cycle. We commend Jamaica on the approval by both Houses of Parliament to amend the Sexual Offences Act to ensure that marital rape in all circumstances is a criminal offence. We look forward to the early completion of the legislative process to give effect to this. Ireland makes the following recommendations. 1. Establish a national human rights institution with a full mandate and independence in line with the Paris Principles. 2. Implement comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation after meaningful consultation with civil society to protect against institutionalised and societal discrimination against socially marginalised groups, including LGBTI persons. Furthermore, decriminalise sexual relations between consenting adults of the same sex, and fully and thoroughly investigate all incidents and acts of violence suspected of being motivated by homophobia or transphobia, and bring to justice those suspected of criminal responsibility. We wish Jamaica every success with this UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the distinguished members of the delegation of Jamaica for the national report and today's presentation. Italy commends the adoption of national plans to implement reforms in the judiciary system and to develop an integrated response to address the issue of children and violence. We also welcome the establishment of a Gender Advisory Council and the adoption of the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence. Madam President, Italy seizes this opportunity to offer Jamaica the following recommendations. Consider introducing a de jure moratorium on capital executions with a view to fully abolish the death penalty. Take effective measures to prevent the excessive use of force by the security forces and investigate all allegations of human rights violations and abuses. Continue the efforts to improve detention conditions and consider further actions concerning alternative measures to imprisonment to keep minors separated from adults, as well as social reintegration programs. Enhance the efforts to eliminate gender-based violence and discrimination against women. Decriminalize consensual same-sex relations and combat discrimination and violence against LGBTI persons. We wish Jamaica a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Japan.
Thank you. Japan warmly welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to this session. Japan highly appreciates the positive steps taken by Jamaica to protect and promote the rights of women, including the launch of the Gender Equality Seal program, aiming to empower women. Japan would like to make 2 recommendations. 1. Strengthen efforts to further promote gender equality, including through public awareness raising campaigns on gender. And 2. Take further measures to eliminate human trafficking, including providing adequate protection to all victims of trafficking and strengthening mechanisms to investigate cases of trafficking in persons. Is it consistent with the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons? We wish the delegation of Jamaica every success in the review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Kenya commends Jamaica delegation on their national report and applauds the government's efforts to the promotion and protection of human rights. We also commend the country for ratifying various conventions, among them Convention Concerning Decent Work for Domestic Workers, and enacting a national law on child diversion. We make the following recommendations for consideration. Continue with efforts to establish a national human rights institution as was adopted by the UNHRC Resolution 1992/54 in line with the Paris Principles. Take necessary measures to provide women and children greater protection against domestic violence. Third, take necessary steps to end gender-based violence, including sensitizing the population on related laws and their implementation. Kenya wishes Jamaica a successful UPR. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Malaysia.
Malaysia thanks the delegation of Jamaica for the presentation of its national report to the 36 UPR Working Group. Malaysia welcomes Jamaica's efforts to implement recommendations accepted in its second UPR. We welcome Jamaica's measures to address trafficking in persons, including the appointment of a national rapporteur on trafficking in persons, as well as the National Action Plan to combat trafficking in persons. We hope that efforts in investigation and prosecution of perpetrators, as well as the protection and assistance rendered to victims of trafficking, will be sustained and further strengthened. Malaysia further welcomes Jamaica's National HIV/STI program, which, among others, seeks to facilitate those living with and affected by the HIV access to treatment, care, and support services without fear of stigma or discrimination. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Malaysia recommends the following. 1. Take efforts to establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 2. Allocate adequate human and financial resources to the Office of the National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons and strengthen the implementation of the National Action Plan to combat trafficking in persons. And 3. Strengthen legislation to ensure better protection of people living with HIV/AIDS. Malaysia wishes Jamaica a successful review.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Maldives.
Thank you, Excellency. The Maldives extends a warm welcome to the high-level delegation of Jamaica to this third cycle review and thank them for their presentation today. Maldives is encouraged by Jamaica's commitment to the climate change adaptation and mitigation agenda through the development of policy instruments and the implementation of these actions across the nation. We also commend the establishment of the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons. In constructive spirit, the Maldives presents the following 2 recommendations to Jamaica. 1. To strengthen its efforts to promote gender equality and equal participation in decision-making positions in public and political life. And 2. To strengthen its efforts to ensure that all children complete their compulsory education and adopt a compulsory education policy for youth. We wish our fellow small island developing state, Jamaica, every success at this review. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of the Marshall Islands welcomes the esteemed delegation of Jamaica to the third cycle of the UPR and thank them for their national report. We note the commendable progress that Jamaica has undertaken towards its human rights obligations at all levels since its last review. We welcome Jamaica's ongoing efforts to further build upon this progress as evident through numerous initiatives that commenced during the reporting period. These include the publication of a gender mainstreaming manual in 2016 and the establishment of a gender advisory council in 2018, along with guidelines that have improved gender balance in public leadership and an action plan on gender-based violence, among others. Having said that, as a fellow CITS, we also urge Jamaica to step up and expand its efforts in addressing environmental matters at all levels. In a constructive spirit, we recommend the following for Jamaica's consideration. 1. Ratify the Escazú Agreement. 2. Ratify the remaining human rights treaties. 3. Ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And 4. Continue to expand efforts to reduce poverty, particularly among rural populations. We wish the delegation of Jamaica a very successful review during this third UPR cycle. Komodada, and thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Mauritius.
Madam President, Mauritius would like to extend a very warm welcome to the high-level delegation from Jamaica. We also congratulate Jamaica for the presentation of its UPR report for its third cycle. We commend Jamaica for its National Development Plan, which provides the country with a long-term strategic vision to achieve the SDGs in a cross-cutting manner. We also congratulate Jamaica for its climate change resilience programs, for the conduct of its awareness campaigns, and, importantly, for supporting its decision-making process on climate issues, on research and sustainability studies. We are impressed by the significant efforts of Jamaica to combat trafficking in persons, including through the appointment of a national rapporteur. In a constructive spirit, and as a sisterly nation, we would like to recommend that Jamaica take steps to promote universal access to education with a view to achieving SDG 4, and that Jamaica consolidate efforts to protect vulnerable groups, such as women and children, from all forms of exploitation. We wish Jamaica well and a very successful review. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Mexico.
Thank you, Vice President. We thank the Jamaican delegation for presenting its national report. We acknowledge efforts to overhaul the legal framework to strengthen protection for women and children from violence, as well as the protection of domestic workers. We encourage Jamaica to implement these reforms and to pursue its participation initiatives such as Spotlight and the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. With a view to strengthening efforts in the area of human rights, we recommend that 1. You abolish the death penalty and accede to the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2. Ensure that alleged abuse committed by law enforcement officers, including those under the state of emergency, are swiftly investigated, perpetrators punished, and victims given access to effective reparation. 3. To adopt a legal framework to combat discrimination encompassing both the public and private sectors with a broad definition and in line with international human rights standards. 4. Decriminalise same-sex sexual relations between consenting adults and punish acts of discrimination, harassment and violence against the LGBTI community, ensuring their human rights. We wish Jamaica every success.
And I'll give the floor to Montenegro.
Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of Jamaica. Montenegro is pleased to note that Jamaica's cooperation with the mechanisms of UN human rights system, including UN treaty bodies, and the government's commitment to working to promote human rights. That said, the adoption of a pending government decision to establish a national human rights institution in line with the party's principles would be a significant step toward that goal. Montenegro commends the adoption of National Development Plan, Vision 2030 Jamaica, as a strategic roadmap for a better quality of life and secure and prosperous future for all its citizens. We also welcome the enactment of the Child Diversion Act, as well as the establishment of the Gender Advisory Council. On this note, Montenegro also reiterates its call to Jamaica to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, aiming at abolition of the death penalty. Montenegro would like to make the following recommendation to Jamaica. First, to issue an open standing invitation for visits of international and regional special procedure mandate holders, and second, to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Morocco.
Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Vice President, please allow me at the outset to welcome the Jamaican delegation and congratulate it on the presentation to the UPR Working Group. Morocco is pleased to note Jamaica's focus, on the one hand, to development through the implementation of the National Development Plan, Vision 2030, and on the other hand, the rights of children through the enactment of the Child Diversion Act in 2017 and efforts to draw up rehabilitation programs for juvenile offenders. And lastly, women's rights through creating the Gender Advisory Council, tasked with implementing the National Gender Equality Plan. We have the following recommendations. 1, to pursue efforts to fight discrimination and violence against women, particularly domestic violence and sexual harassment. And 2, to pursue efforts to ratify outstanding international instruments. My delegation is sure that Jamaica will be successful in overcoming human rights challenges. Thank you.
Madam President, Myanmar welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to the UPR Working Group and thanks them for the national report. We recognize the efforts taken by Jamaica to implement the recommendations since the previous cycle of UPR. We also take note of our current process to establish a national human rights institution in consultation with the public and private stakeholders. We look forward to the timely establishment of a national mechanism. The adoption of National Poverty Reduction Program and National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence are commendable. In a spirit of constructive engagement, I would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Continue its efforts to combat trafficking in persons and allocate sufficient budget for provisions of essential support services to and rehabilitation for victims of trafficking and exploitation. 2. Continue measures to eliminate gender-based violence through awareness raising and training programs among public officials and law enforcement personnel. And 3. Enhance ongoing efforts to eliminate poverty in accordance with its national program. We wish that Jamaica a successful UPR. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Namibia.
Thank you, Madam President. Namibia extends a warm welcome to the delegation of Jamaica to the third cycle of the UPR and thank them for the national report presented today. We commend Jamaica for human rights-related legislative and institutional initiatives undertaken since the last review. These include, inter alia, joining the regional agreement on access to justice in environmental matters and the establishment of an interministerial committee on human rights. In the spirit of constructive engagement, we make the following recommendations for considerations by Jamaica. 1. Establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. And 2. Ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We wish the delegation of Jamaica a successful review. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to the third cycle of UPR and thanks them for the presentation of national report. Nepal appreciates Jamaica for its advancement in the climate change agenda, including through the establishment of institutional mechanisms and legal policy frameworks to work for the climate change adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. We commend the achievements made so far in improving the quality of life of Jamaicans through the implementation of the National Development Plan Vision 2030 of Jamaica. We also take note of the efforts undertaken by the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons to prevent human trafficking. We recommend the following for consideration by Jamaica. 1. Consider establishing an independent national human rights institution in compliance with the Paris Principles. 2. Continue taking measures to promote gender equality in the political and public life. To conclude, we wish Jamaica a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Netherlands.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks the delegation of Jamaica for the presentation of its national report. We commend Jamaica for the launch of a 10-year national strategic action plan to eliminate gender-based violence. However, we remain concerned about the rights of LGBTI persons. To date, Jamaica has provisions in place that criminalize consensual same-sex relationships. Moreover, a 2019 Awareness, Attitude and Perception Survey shows broad intolerance amongst the general public in Jamaica towards LGBTI people. The Netherlands recommends Jamaica 1. To repeal all provisions that criminalize same-sex relations between consenting adults by 2025. 2. To enact comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation to provide accessible remedies for all forms of discrimination, whether in public or private, and in particular in the context of education, health, housing, social security, employment or accessing services by 2025. The Netherlands wishes Jamaica success with the implementation of the recommendations it receives during the UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I now give the floor back to Her Excellency Foreign Minister Kamina Johnson-Smith to address. Please, Your Excellency, accept our apology for the technical difficulties earlier, and we hope that we can listen to the rest of your presentation now. Have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I will pick up from the point at which the technology let us down. However, the economy is now expected to contract by over 5%, and unemployment has already risen. Furthermore, government revenues are estimated to decline by double digits, even as expenditure needs rise to meet emergency health services, as well as social and economic support. Nevertheless, the government of Jamaica continues its journey on the path of national transformation through Jamaica's 2009 National Development Plan, Vision 2030, which is fully aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals of the globally agreed Agenda 2030. The government has also implemented strategies to lower the country's crime rates, boost economic growth and environmental sustainability, and reduce the rate of chronic non-communicable diseases, as well as poverty levels, particularly rural and child poverty. Mr. Vice President, I will now provide an overview of specific developments since the second review cycle in respect of the recommendations accepted by Jamaica, the majority of which have been successfully implemented. I will begin with the consultative process. The government of Jamaica now has an interministerial committee on human rights established by cabinet approval in 2018 and chaired by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. It facilitates dialogue among a wide range of stakeholders, including civil society representatives, on the implementation of Jamaica's obligations under various human rights treaties and related reporting activities to treaty bodies. I must underscore here that this process of inclusive and broad-based multi-stakeholder consultations also informed the preparation of Jamaica's national report for this review. On the acceptance of international norms, Jamaica is party to 7 of the 9 core international human rights instruments. Since the presentation of our second cycle in 2015, Jamaica also ratified the Convention Concerning Decent Work for Domestic Workers in 2016. We acceded to the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction in 2017, signed the Regional Agreement on Access to Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2019. And more recently, in October 2020, we ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Jamaica has also submitted reports to the relevant treaty bodies in respect of its ongoing implementation of the following: the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. On issues relating to gender equality, the National Policy for Gender Equality adopted in 2011 underscores the government's unwavering commitment to achieving gender equality through a range of policy and legislative measures that are geared towards increasing gender mainstreaming, underpinned by principles of social justice, human rights, equality and equity, good governance, accountability, transparency, and participation. The government has adopted an inclusive approach that focuses on men and women to combat gender-based violence, advance gender equality, and promote economic balance and growth. In addition, under the leadership of the Bureau of Gender Affairs, the government has worked in collaboration with international partners, such as the UNDP, to further strengthen gender equality programs and initiatives, such as the 2016 Gender Equality SEAL program, which seeks to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women, including through the creation of equitable conditions for women and men in the workplace. In addition, the government has been placing increased focus on improving the number of women in leadership and decision-making positions. In this regard, policy guidelines were developed in 2018 on the nomination, selection, and appointment of board members of public bodies in Jamaica to promote women's participation on public boards. Let me also highlight that while there is still more to do, the current composition of Jamaica's parliament reflects an increase in the participation of women in decision-making to the highest level in Jamaica's history. Jamaica is also notably the only Caribbean country participating in the Win-Win Gender Equality Means Good Business program, which is being implemented in Latin America and the Caribbean. This program focuses on strengthening the leadership of women in business. The Bureau of Gender Affairs is currently implementing the National Strategic Action Plan to Eliminate Gender-Based Violence 2017 to 2027, which was approved in 2017. The plan provides for an integrated, multi-sectoral and structured approach to addressing the key issues and challenges of gender-based violence, with a strategic focus on victims, survivors, perpetrators, and witnesses of acts of violence. Its approach is also centered on human rights principles and guides stakeholders in understanding and fulfilling their obligations under international instruments, which preserve non-discrimination and protect against human rights violations. The establishment of a Gender Advisory Council was also approved by Cabinet on the 8th of January 2018 for a period of 3 years. The Council is a multi-sectoral body charged with guiding the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the National Policy for Gender Equality and the approved National Strategic Action Plan to end gender-based violence in Jamaica. The government is also in the process of setting up regional shelters that will provide a safe haven for women fleeing situations of domestic abuse. I'm pleased to report that one shelter has been completed, and in addition to being the first child-friendly center, when fully optimized, will also offer a range of counseling, reintegration, and training support services to victims. Mr. Vice President, on human rights, education, and training. The protection of human rights and the rule of law remain priorities for the government of Jamaica, as is evidenced by the initiatives undertaken thus far. The Ministry of National Security is currently developing the Law Enforcement Protection of Integrity Act, which will define the standards of operation for all individuals engaged in law enforcement activities, to include consideration for human rights and further enhance public confidence in law enforcement agencies. Training seminars to build the capacity of the police in children's rights and appropriate child justice strategies have also been conducted by the Office of the Children's Advocate within the various ranks of the Jamaica Constabulary Force in all geographic areas and police divisions. The government of Jamaica is also promulgating a less lethal weapons policy, which will provide a regime that will regulate access to less lethal devices, such as pepper sprays for personal protection, as well as to facilitate options for graduated use of force by security forces in the application of LLWs, such as electroshock weapons, thereby reducing the potential for excessive use of force against the public. The Jamaica Constabulary Force's policy for the use of body-worn cameras in police operations was drafted in 2016. Body-worn cameras were acquired to enhance the provisions for human rights and human dignity and form part of the government's thrust to ensure that citizens' human rights are not violated when police officers are dealing with civilians. Mr. Vice President, let me now turn to the issue of conditions of detention. The government of Jamaica has embarked upon the development of an offender management policy, which will, among other things, inform the amendment of the Corrections Act of 1985 and the Parole Act of 1978. The amendments will seek to, 1, modernize the legislative framework governing the operations of the Department of Correctional Services, 2, improve the processes and procedures relating to the care and management of offenders, 3, facilitate the expansion of rehabilitation and reintegration programs, and 4, increase compliance with and further align the acts and the regulations with international conventions, laws, and best practices. Mr. Vice President, I move to the prohibition of slavery and trafficking. The National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons, established in 2005, continues to operate as an interministerial group, including membership from NGOs, with focus on the prevention and suppression of trafficking in persons, investigation and prosecution of offenders, as well as the protection and provision of assistance to victims of trafficking. The task force has also been active in promoting public education campaigns and awareness-raising activities to protect against trafficking. In this regard, its first international conference on human trafficking was hosted in July 2018, along with the launch in 2019 of the Anti-Trafficking in Persons clubs in approximately 20 secondary schools across the island. The clubs are intended to equip students and teachers alike with knowledge and tools to help protect them against becoming victims. Jamaica has also ratified the Palermo Protocol, the UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. In keeping with its international obligations, the government enacted the Trafficking in Persons, Prevention, Suppression, and Punishment Act 2007. There has been recent focus on strengthening the national and legislative framework for the elimination of trafficking, including through amendments enacted in January 2018. Amendments to the Trafficking in Persons, Prevention, Suppression, and Punishment Act allowed for human trafficking cases to be tried by judge alone. This includes individuals who have either committed or facilitated the trafficking of children, or who withhold, remove, or destroy any travel document belonging to another person. It also includes clauses to make restitution to the victims and to provide them with protection to prevent them from being recaptured or from becoming victims of reprisals. Additionally, the Child Care and Protection Act 2004 was amended in 2018 to increase the sentence for the sale or trafficking of a child from 10 years imprisonment to 20. Mr. Vice President, I move to the matter of right to education. The government has been increasingly pursuing an evidence-based approach to education, the focus on standardization of the curriculum and enhancing the framework and systems for assessment from the early childhood education to secondary levels of education to inform appropriate teaching and learning approaches and interventions to address specific learner needs. Several new schools have been established and existing ones upgraded. Emphasis continues to be placed on early childhood education. There is also increased focus on strengthening the structures for labor market relevant certification, school to work transition, and entrepreneurship. The needs of the vulnerable remain a priority for the government of Jamaica. The Program of Advancement through Health and Education, PATH, is one such initiative to address these needs. Since 2016, the budget allocation for PATH and the school feeding program has been increased by 83%. The program currently has approximately 307,320 registered beneficiaries receiving cash grants, and they are paid on a bi-monthly basis. 73% of registered beneficiaries are children, and special arrangements were included to address the outfall from COVID-19. Mr. Vice President, the protection of the vulnerable in society, such as children, the elderly, women, and persons with disabilities, remain a critical area of focus for the government. On issues relating to the protection of children, we note that in 2015, the Break the Silence campaign was launched to encourage the public, especially children, to report all known or suspected cases of abuse, as well as to encourage adults and children to refrain from abusing children. This campaign was accompanied by an extensive public awareness campaign, which was later expanded in 2016 to include a Break the Silence school tour. In November 2017, the Office of the Children's Registry was merged with the Child Development Agency to form the Child Protection and Family Services Agency. Also in 2017, the Child Case Management System was launched with the aim to assess the needs of each child and his or her family who access the services of the CPFSA. Family courts are charged with the task of making decisions and provisions for the administration of the protection and well-being of children from birth to 18 years, along with children's officers who have the responsibility of representing the rights of children brought before these courts. There are 54 child care facilities island-wide, 9 of which are managed and operated by the government of Jamaica through the CPFSA. Over the years, the agency has placed greater emphasis on living in family environment, LIFE programs, as an alternative to residential care. LIFE programs enable children to live in familial settings even as they are in the care of the state. As a Pathfinder country, Jamaica launched the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children in November 2016. As a part of a long-term strategic plan focused on resolving challenges relating to children, the National Plan of Action for an Integrated Response to Children and Violence was launched in November 2019. The national plan was informed by a multi-sectoral and agency consultative process that deals with the main issues and challenges relating to children. Further, it provides for more comprehensive initiatives promoting positive and effective parenting strategies and an increase in services that offer behavior modification interventions to both physically abused children and for parents who resort to violence. Mr. President, I move to juvenile justice. The Child Diversion Act, which was passed in 2018, embodies Jamaica's acknowledgement of the desirability of a child's rehabilitation and reintegration into society in alignment with their best interests. The legislation was developed to provide alternative means of dealing with children in conflict with the law, instead of instituting criminal proceedings against children. The Act aims to provide children who have committed a diversion offense and who accept responsibility for that offense to be admitted into a child diversion program unless the public interest requires otherwise. The Ministry of Justice has established a child diversion office that oversees the implementation of the Act. The Child Diversion Office is responsible for the rehabilitation of children in conflict with the law in consultation with the National Child Diversion Oversight Committees and Child Diversion Committees established in each parish. With the support of our international partners, our Ministry of Justice is currently in the process of establishing justice centers in each parish in keeping with the provisions of the Child Diversion Act. There are currently 5 justice centers in full operation. And as at October 2020, the Child Diversion Program offices and committees are also fully operational in each of the 14 parishes. To give effect to the Act and further ensure the care of children in conflict with the law, the 2015 Child Interaction Policy has been amended and is now replaced with the Child Interaction and Diversion Policy and Procedures. This is currently being reviewed and refined for promulgation. Mr. Vice President, I now move to persons with disabilities. Following the passage of the Disabilities Act in 2014 and initial island-wide consultations, consultants were engaged to complete the codes of practice as determined by the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities to facilitate the implementation of the Disabilities Act. In keeping with the Act, new schools being built under the Education System Transformation Program provide for access by students with disabilities. For students in older facilities, where necessary, ramps are installed to facilitate easier movement. In-service workshops are being conducted to help teachers to better understand the behavior of students with disabilities and how they should be treated. Within the last 2 years, Jamaica has added to its capacity for early intervention of disabilities in children through the opening of a diagnostic, assessment, and intervention center in the central region of the island at the Churches Teachers College in Manchester, and a diagnostic and early intervention center in the western region of the island at the Sam Sharp Teachers College in St. James. A third is currently being constructed in the eastern region of the College of Agriculture, Science and Education. And with the inclusion of the Micro University College Child Assessment and Research in Education Care Center, established as far back as 1981 in Kingston, this will bring the total to 4 care centers in Jamaica. Mr. President, I want to turn attention to the foundational issue of the right to development, general measures of implementation. We are advancing the climate change agenda at the national level through a range of policy initiatives, as well as the implementation of strategic adaptation, mitigation, and resilience building projects and programs. Further to the preparation of the climate change policy framework in 2015, the government commenced the updating of the policy to reflect 1.5 degrees considerations and other emergent issues at the time. The policy framework laid the groundwork to establish and sustain an institutional mechanism that will develop, coordinate, and implement policies, sectoral plans, programs, strategies, and legislation for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Most natural disasters in Jamaica are climate-related, including drought, hurricane, tropical storms, and extreme rainfall events. We have only recently been impacted by the latter that have caused significant damage to our road infrastructure, homes, farms, businesses, and other private property. The financial toll is still being assessed by the government, but will be very difficult to meet, especially in this pandemic. The successive negative impact of these events, especially on the country's GDP, has brought to the fore once more the need to update the legislative and institutional frameworks and increase the resilience of the natural environment, institutional capacity building, development planning, and geospatial data management. Related legislative achievements include the promulgation of the Disaster Risk Management Act 2015, which among other things makes provision for the designation of special vulnerable areas and disaster areas to improve disaster prevention and response, as well as the Building Act 2018, which seeks to reduce the vulnerability of the built environment and ensure public safety. Recognizing its climate sensitivity, the country has undertaken research to improve understanding of climate change impacts and support decision-making. Several transformational projects and programs were also undertaken to support climate change adaptation and resilience, including the rollout of investment projects to advance Jamaica's strategic program for climate resilience. The projects, which are being implemented with support from climate investment funds, have sought to comprehensively strengthen climate change adaptation and build resilience in coastal and human settlements, and most importantly, in key sectors such as the water, tourism, health, and agricultural sectors. In support of mitigation efforts globally, Jamaica prepared and submitted its intended nationally determined contributions, its INDC, to the UNFCCC in November 2015, which became the nationally determined contributions when the country ratified the Paris Agreement in 2017. The NDCs outline the country's proposed efforts in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and as such, focus primarily on the energy sector. The expected reductions are 7.8% of the emissions levels relative to 2005 by the year 2030. Jamaica was further empowered to complete and submit its revised and enhanced NDCs in June 2020 as a result of focusing on other sectors such as water and transportation. Notably, Jamaica deposited its instrument of accession to the Statute of the Small Island Developing States SIDS-DOC in February 2017, having been associated with the Trans-Regional Sustainable Energy and Climate Resilience Initiative since its inception in 2009 and launch in 2010. Jamaica also deposited its instrument of acceptance of the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol in October 2020. In September 2018, the Prime Minister of Jamaica and the President of France were invited and agreed to co-lead the political process launched by the Secretary General of the UN to support and advance the mobilization of climate financing ahead of the Climate Action Summit of September 2019. In 2019, the Green Climate Fund approved the first replenishment with pledges amounting to 9.8 billion United States dollars. This replenishment benefited from the political advocacy mobilized at the Climate Action Summit. Following from that involvement, Jamaica in 2019 became the first country in the English-speaking Caribbean to formally join the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action to assist governments to mobilize resources to implement climate action plans. This speaks to our firm commitment to mitigating climate change effects on our citizens and globally. Mr. Vice President, I conclude by reiterating Jamaica's commitment to the implementation of the agreed recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review for the purpose of protecting the human rights of our citizens and upholding our demonstrable respect for the rule of law. In spite of the significant progress achieved that I've outlined here, Jamaica faces specific challenges. These include capacity constraints and our vulnerability to external shocks, which pose very real constraints to the country's ability to implement the full range of measures which we would wish all our citizens to enjoy. The current pandemic is a very real example of a high-impact external shock. The recent heavy rainfalls, yet another. The government of Jamaica will strive to further improve on existing measures towards the advancement of the civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights of all citizens, while giving special attention to the protection of the most vulnerable. We also thank our many bilateral and multilateral partners who have offered technical assistance and other types of assistance to ensure the development of national capacities to meet our obligations to the people of Jamaica. We will continue to rely on their support as we strive to strengthen the human rights and dignity of the Jamaican people. Mr. Vice President, Jamaica looks forward to the very fruitful and constructive engagement during this third review cycle. I will turn over to you to take us through the remainder of the segments of the interactive dialogue. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency. And we will now continue with our interactive dialogue, and I'll give the floor to Niger.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Niger would like to wish a warm welcome to the Jamaican delegation and congratulate it for the presentation of its national report. Niger welcomes the inclusive and participative approach which has characterized the drafting of this highly informative report, and is delighted to welcome the particular progress accomplished by Jamaica in the promotion of human rights since the last UPR. Niger would like to welcome the adoption by Jamaica of its national policy on poverty and its poverty reduction programme in order to strategically tackle issues around poverty through a concerted effort. To encourage this, Niger would like to recommend to Jamaica that it step up its process to establish an NHRI according to the Paris Principles, also to explore the possibility of signing up to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel or Inhuman Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and explore the possibility of signing up to the International Convention to Protect Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. To conclude, Niger would like to wish Jamaica every success in the implementation of the recommendations arising from this review. Thank you.
And I'll give the floor to Nigeria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Nigeria warmly welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to the presentation of the country's national report for the third cycle UPR and thanks it for the update provided today. We commend the government of Jamaica for its efforts in implementing previous recommendations and its continued cooperation and engagement with the UPR process and other human rights mechanisms. Nigeria takes positive note of measures adopted by the government of Jamaica with a view to combating gender-based violence, ensuring poverty reduction, as well as addressing the effect of climate change. We also commend the government for its efforts in combating human trafficking and ensuring the right to adequate standard of living. While recognizing the various efforts by the government of Jamaica in upholding human rights and in the spirit of constructive dialogue, Nigeria makes the following recommendations for the consideration of Jamaica. 1. Continue efforts in ensuring poverty reduction, adequate standard of living, and the protection of persons in vulnerable situations. And 2, continue to adopt necessary measures to address the effect of climate change. Finally, we wish Jamaica a very successful review process. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Pakistan welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to its third UPR report and thank them for its detailed presentation. We commend Jamaica's efforts to honor its human rights obligations through various measures. We also note Jamaica's commitment to establish national human rights institution. The progress made under the National Development Plan Vision 2030 in improving livelihoods and integration of key development area is indeed noteworthy. The implementation of National Poverty Reduction Program is also a welcome development. We acknowledge that resources constraints, and climate change are major impediments to socio-economic development in the country. There is indeed a need for greater international support, especially to mitigate the effects of climate change and promoting the sustainable development agenda. We recommend Jamaica to, number one, continue to take efforts for the establishment of national human rights institution, and number two, to sustain effort towards operationalization of the National Development Plan. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Panama.
Thank you very much, President. Panama welcomes the distinguished delegation of Jamaica and thanks it for presenting its national report. We're glad to see the implementation of the National Development Plan, as well as the adoption of programmes to reduce poverty and mitigate and adapt to climate change. In a constructive spirit of cooperation, we recommend that Jamaica consider the possibility of extending a standing invitation to the mandate holders of the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. 2, that they ratify the second optional protocol of the ICCPR, aimed at abolishing the death penalty, and the regional agreement on access to information, public participation and access to justice in environmental affairs in Latin America and the Caribbean. And thirdly, that they roll out curricula in schools promoting a culture of peace and protecting children from all forms of violence, in particular bullying, and that they establish psychosocial support procedures and deal with the appropriate support for those children affected. We wish Jamaica every success for this third UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to Paraguay.
Vice President, Paraguay greets the distinguished delegation of Jamaica and thanks it for presenting its report. We would like to commend the progress made in the area of legislation, normative framework and national action plans to reduce poverty. We particularly welcome initiatives to support women, such as the Comprehensive Manual for Gender Perspectives and the Advisory Council on Gender, as well as the Action Plan on GBV. We'd like to express our concern regarding the lack of an NHRI and the lack of no standing invitation to the special procedures, as well as delays in reports to the treaty bodies. Paraguay respectfully recommends that Jamaica ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel or Inhuman Degrading Treatment or Punishments and its optional protocol in line with SDG 16. Secondly, that they ratify the second optional protocol on the ICCPR and take the necessary measures, including awareness-raising campaigns, which will allow the prompt abolition of the death penalty in line with SDG 16. Thirdly, that they establish a permanent national mechanism to implement, monitor and provide follow-up on recommendations in the sphere of human rights, considering the possibility of receiving cooperation to do this in the context of SDG 16 and 17. Thank you.
Much, and I'll give the floor to Peru.
President, Peru wishes a warm welcome to the Jamaican delegation and thanks it for its presentation. We recognise the progress made by Jamaica, including the establishment of a national group to combat trafficking. In a constructive vein, Peru recommends that Jamaica evaluate reforms to the legal system, which would lead to strengthening procedural guarantees and lending sufficient services to people to access the system. Secondly, that they step up their efforts to combat trafficking in children with the aims of sexual exploitation and forced labour. And thirdly, that they consider assigning the necessary resources to appropriately implement the decade-long strategy to eliminate GBV. Peru would like to wish Jamaica every success with this UPR cycle, and we hope that it continues to improve human rights in its country. Thank you.
Much. I'll give the floor to the Philippines.
Thank you, Chair. The Philippines warmly welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to this UPR session. We appreciate Jamaica's ratification of the ILO Domestic Work Convention in 2011, in line with the recommendation made by the Philippines during the last cycle. We also commend the Jamaican government for the significant progress made in implementing measures in combating trafficking in persons. The Philippines is open to possible cooperation with Jamaica in this regard. The Philippines also notes with appreciation the efforts made by the government in the areas of gender mainstreaming and human rights education and training. In a constructive spirit, the Philippines presents the following recommendations for consideration by Jamaica. 1. Further steps towards the establishment of a national human rights institution that is compliant with the Paris Principles. 2. Further strengthen the provision of appropriate services to victims of trafficking, especially women and children, to facilitate their rehabilitation and social integration. And 3. Intensify efforts to combat child labor, including by strengthening policy measures and social programs. We wish Jamaica every success in this review cycle. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Portugal.
Madam President, Portugal welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and notes with appreciation the approval of the country's first long-term and results-based strategic development plan, Vision 2030. While noting the de facto moratorium on executions in place since 1988, Portugal recommends that Jamaica abolishes the death penalty and ratifies the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. Portugal recommends further that Jamaica, 1. Amends the Sexual Offences Act with a view to criminalizing all forms of marital rape and implements effectively the Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence, guaranteeing due reporting, investigation and prosecution of gender-based violence, particularly domestic and sexual violence, abuse and harassment. 2. Annex a comprehensive anti-discrimination law to prohibit all forms of discrimination, namely on grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, disability and health status. And finally, 3. Ensure investigated. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we'd like to welcome the delegation of Jamaica and thank them for the report. We're satisfied to note that Jamaica has taken steps to strengthen legal instruments for the protection of human rights, in particular the ratification of international treaties on human rights, the adoption of new laws aimed at implementing the recommendations as a result of the second UPR cycle. We also should praise the efforts of Kingston to improve the quality of life of persons with disabilities, strengthening the institution of the family, and promotion of traditional values. We recommend to Jamaica the following: prevent domestic violence, ensure better monitoring over the functioning of law enforcement agencies, and 3, reform the functioning of the penitentiary system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Rwanda.
Thank you, Vice President. Rwanda is pleased to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Jamaica to the UPR process and thanks them for the presentation of the national report. Rwanda takes positive note of the effort made by Jamaica in the promotion and protection of human rights in the country since the previous review. In particular, we applaud the government's effort to combat poverty and inequality and the implementation of Vision 2030. Rwanda also appreciates the adoption of the National Action Plan to combat trafficking in person, as well as the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence. Rwanda would like to make the following recommendations for the consideration by Jamaica. 1, establish a national human rights institution in accordance with Paris Principles. 2, to consider abolishing the death penalty. 3, to continue to take necessary measures to increase participation of women in public and political life. We wish Jamaica a success UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Senegal.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Thank you very much, President. Senegal wishes a warm welcome to the Jamaican delegation on the occasion of the presentation of its national report under the aegis of the 36th UPR, and congratulates the Jamaican government for the progress made in the sphere of human rights, in particular the efforts made by the state to combat poverty and inequality, as well as the rollout of the Vision 2030 National Development Plan and the establishment of a national structure responsible for combating trafficking in persons. My delegation is pleased to see these efforts and makes the following recommendations. Firstly, to continue current policy efforts aimed at reducing prison overcrowding, including exploring alternatives to imprisonments, and also to improve detention conditions, in particular sanitary conditions and access to medical care. And secondly, that they establish an NHRI and provide it with a mandate and independence in line with the Paris Principles. To conclude, we wish every success to Jamaica, and Senegal calls on the international community to support this country. Thank you.
And I give the floor to Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone warmly welcomes. Mr. Vice President, Sierra Leone warmly welcomes and thanks the delegation of Jamaica for the presentation of its national report and for its engagements with the UPR process. A delegation commends the government of Jamaica for establishing a national human rights institution. In a spirit of constructive engagement, Sierra Leone makes the following recommendation to the government of Jamaica. 1, we renew our call for a moratorium with a view to abolishing the death penalty. 2, consider ratifying the ICPPED and the Convention Against Torture. 3, address gender-based violence and all other forms of violence with a view to bringing perpetrators to justice. And 4, take measures to decrease detention of children, migrants, and reduce prison overcrowding. Sierra Leone urges the government of Jamaica to provide adequate funding to its national human rights institution to guarantee its independence and freedom from government control in conformity with the Paris Principles. My delegation notes that women, children, and minorities are among vulnerable groups that require robust protective measures by the government of Jamaica. In conclusion, Sierra Leone wishes Jamaica every success in its third review cycle. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Singapore.
Mr. Vice President, Singapore welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and commends them on its continued progress towards realizing the key goals of its Vision 2030. We acknowledge the extensive efforts made by Jamaica to further advance the rights of women. This includes appointing a cabinet minister with a specific focus on gender affairs, the establishment of a gender advisory council in 2018, and the launch of a national strategic action plan to eliminate gender-based violence in Jamaica from 2017 to 2027. Singapore recommends that Jamaica continue its efforts to promote gender equality at the substantive and societal levels, including through awareness-raising initiatives aimed at eliminating structural and cultural barriers to achieving meaningful equality. We also note that Jamaica has a coordinated intergovernmental approach to addressing poverty through the National Policy of Poverty and the National Poverty Reduction Program. Given that the COVID-19 pandemic will, in many societies, exacerbate and undo gains made to eradicate poverty, Singapore recommends that Jamaica continue to maintain a strong focus in its national development plans of poverty reduction, especially in rural areas, accounting in particular for the adverse impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on people living in poverty. As a fellow small island state, Singapore wishes Jamaica success in its efforts to overcome the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. We are confident that Jamaica will be able to build back better and achieve its human rights and development objectives. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Slovenia.
Madam President, Slovenia would like to thank the delegation of Jamaica for the presentation today, as well as support its efforts to implement all core instruments of the international human rights law and cooperate with the mechanisms of the UN human rights systems, including the UN treaty bodies, also in the future. We would like to provide the following recommendations. First, to establish a national human rights institution and provide it with full mandate and independence in line with the principles relating to the status of national institutions for the promotion and protection of human rights. Second, to issue a standing invitation for visits of special procedure mandate holders. And third, to amend the Sexual Offence Act to provide immunity for medical professionals against prosecution for aiding a child sex offense for bona fide action taken with sexually active adolescents below 16 years to prevent pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, to protect the child's physical safety or emotional well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to South Africa.
Thank you, Chair. South Africa welcomes the Honourable Minister and the distinguished delegation of Jamaica to this UPR. South Africa congratulates Jamaica on its implementation of Vision 2030, which is evidence-driven, underpinned by principles of sustainability, equity, inclusion, and integrates the economic, social, environmental, and governmental aspects of the national development. South Africa respectfully wishes to make the following recommendations. Continue the commendable efforts by the government to boost economic development, environmental sustainability, and reduce the rate of chronic communicable diseases and poverty levels, particularly in rural and child poverty. 2, continue the efforts to meet reporting obligations in spite of human and resource constraints, which can hinder the timely submission of reports, and continue the consistent demonstration of willingness to cooperate with the mechanisms of the UN human rights system and the treaty bodies. South Africa wishes Jamaica a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Spain.
Spain welcomes the participation of Jamaica in this process and thanks it for its participation. Spain recommends 1, that Jamaica sign up to the second optional protocol of the ICCPR aimed at abolishing the death penalty, and that it amends the relevant legislative instruments to abolish totally the death penalty in the country. Spain notes with satisfaction that Jamaica is a state party to the majority of international instruments on human rights, and recommends, secondly, that Jamaica sign up to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel or Inhuman, Degrading or Punishment and its optional protocol. Spain welcomes progress made by Jamaica in promoting the rights of women and girls in terms of gender equality and combats GBV. Spain thirdly recommends that they adopt policies and instruments to guarantee the full enjoyment by women and girls of economic, social and cultural rights, particularly in the sphere of access to health services and the labour market on an equal footing. Spain expresses its concern regarding the situation of LGBTI individuals and recommends fourthly that Jamaica adopt the necessary legislative measures to prevent discrimination against LGBTI people and that they also decriminalise consensual adult same-sex relations. Thank you.
Sri Lanka.
Madam President, Sri Lanka warmly welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and appreciates the useful information shared. We commend progress achieved by Jamaica since its second UPR in protecting and promoting human rights, including measures such as the establishment of an interministerial committee on human rights, amendments to the Trafficking in Persons Act, and establishment of a gender advisory council, along with a national strategic action plan to eliminate gender-based violence. We also recognize Jamaica's efforts as a nation affected by climate-related natural disasters towards building resilience and awareness in this area through policy, innovation, adaptation, and mitigation. In a constructive spirit, Sri Lanka recommends that Jamaica, 1, completes its process of establishing a national human rights institution, 2, continues its efforts at addressing poverty among its population, including through the National Poverty Reduction Program, 3, considers ratifying the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. We wish Jamaica success in its UPR engagement. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Timor-Leste welcomes the Honorable Minister and distinguished delegate of Jamaica and thanks them for the presentation of the national report. With the aim of improving the human rights framework in the country, Timor-Leste makes 3 recommendations. First, that Jamaica decriminalize same-sex sexual act. Second, that Jamaica abolish death penalty. Third, that Jamaica intensify its effort to combat racism and xenophobia. Mr. Vice President, Timor-Leste acknowledges the progresses made in Jamaica. In particular, we welcome the appointment of a national reporter on trafficking in person and the adoption of national action plan to combat trafficking in person. Furthermore, we commend Jamaica for the effort made so far to combat poverty and inequality. Mr. Vice President, finally, Timor-Leste wishes Jamaica all success in its review of the 3rd cycle of the UPR mechanism. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Togo.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Togo wishes a warm welcome to the Jamaican delegation and congratulates it for presenting its 3rd report. My delegation welcomes the strong cooperation of this country with all of the treaty bodies and the UN mechanisms and is particularly pleased to see that Jamaica is a party to the majority of key international human rights instruments. Also that the country has moved forwards with its climate change adaptation programme, particularly emphasising strengthening investment towards energy efficiency and renewable energy. Nonetheless, in order to consolidate these achievements, my delegation makes the following recommendations: to step up the process underway in order to set up an NHRI, proceed with the amendments of the law on abortion, which has unfortunately led to the general criminalisation of abortion, including in the case of pregnancy resulting from rape or incest. We'd like to also see the country work towards gender equality and women's empowerment in public and political life. We wish to make her every success with this review. Thank you.
Very much. I now give the floor back to Her Excellency Foreign Minister Smith to address observations and comments that have been raised so far. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegations, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the intervening states for their recommendations and for their interest in developments in Jamaica as they relate to human rights. Mr. Vice President, let me address some of the recommendations that have been raised, beginning with acceptance of international norms. Jamaica is a party to the American Convention on Human Rights and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which provide for a right to humane treatment and further provide that no one shall be subject to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The country has also implemented various measures at the domestic level to implement its responsibility to ensure that persons within the state's jurisdiction or control are not subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Jamaica, through Section 13, subsection 2, of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, provides for the right to protection from torture or inhuman or degrading punishment or other treatment. The law further provides that no person shall be subjected to torture or inhuman or degrading punishment or other treatment. While Jamaica is not a party to the Convention on Torture, the inclusion of this protection in the Constitution of the country demonstrates Jamaica's commitment to recognition and respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. Jamaica continues to support global efforts to end impunity for those who commit or are otherwise responsible for some of the most heinous crimes. To this end, Jamaica signed the Rome Statute. However, as with most other treaties, Jamaica must have legislation in place before it can proceed to ratification. The legislation is required to give domestic effect to the obligations under the treaty. And this is particularly important where those obligations involve judicial processes or significant limitations on rights such as freedom of the person and movement, etc. Jamaica has commenced the legislative drafting process and assessing the administrative requirements arising from ratification of the statute. As is the case in other developing countries, particularly SIDS, the availability of resources that can be allocated to the ratification process at this time is impacted by the need to address other urgent economic and social conditions. Available resources have been further impacted by the need to respond to the socio-economic and health crisis arising from the coronavirus pandemic and other recently occurring natural disasters. Given that Jamaica has not yet ratified the Rome Statute, we would not be able to ratify the Kampala amendments. Notwithstanding, the provisions of the amendment are being considered as part of the legislative drafting process. Mr. Vice President, on the matter of application of the death penalty, Jamaica has had a long-standing de facto moratorium on the application of the death penalty. There have been no executions in Jamaica since 1988. However, no decision has been taken to formally abolish the death penalty from the law books. Jamaica withdrew from the optional protocol to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights in October 1997, and that withdrawal took effect in 1998. Nonetheless, individuals in Jamaica can submit petitions to another active international body, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The rights considered in a petition to that commission under the American Convention on Human Rights are analogous to the rights that would be considered by the Human Rights Committee under the ICCPR. Individual petitioners, therefore, do retain the right to petition an international human rights body, and they do exercise that right. Moreover, the rights listed in the covenant are also assured to Jamaicans under our Constitution. Violations of those rights can and are challenged through our courts by way of constitutional redress under the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. In the circumstances, the government of Jamaica will not, at this time, reaccede to the optional protocol of the covenant. A decision on the application of the death penalty is within the sovereign jurisdiction of Jamaica, and a de jure moratorium on or the abolition of the death penalty, were it to be decided, should be properly determined collectively by the government and citizens of Jamaica. Mr. Vice President, although I referred to gender-related issues in my opening remarks, let me share some further specifics regarding gender-based and domestic violence, particularly against women. The government's Bureau of Gender Affairs is being strengthened to better coordinate and oversee implementation of the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence and the gender mainstreaming mandate to achieve gender equality in line with the goals of the National Policy for Gender Equality. The plan is primarily focused on violence against women and girls and is guided by the plan's 5 strategic priority areas to eliminate gender-based violence. The strategic priority areas include prevention, protection, investigation, prosecution, and enforcement of orders, enforcement of victims' rights to compensation, reparation, and redress, and protocols for coordination of the NSAP and data management systems. There is ongoing review of local legal instruments to prohibit, prevent, and respond to all forms of gender-based violence, and to treat all victims equally and respectfully, regardless of gender, age, ethnicity, geographical location, religious affiliation, ability, and class. In the interim, we continue to make strides in this area. For example, a memorandum of understanding was signed in September 2018 between the ministry responsible for gender affairs and the UN Women Multi-Country Office of the Caribbean to support the implementation of the plan with funding for the No Excuse for Abuse public education campaign. That campaign has been increasing public awareness of gender-based violence, measures for its prevention, and has enhanced public understanding of the roles of government and civil society in response, guided by gender and behavioral change communication. It has also sought to address sociocultural issues surrounding gender-based violence. The campaign has targeted women ages 15 to 35, men ages 15 to 40, survivors of violence, and persons experiencing violence. It includes persons witnessing or aware of violence, as well as perpetrators of abuse and violence. On March 9, 2020, the government also launched the Spotlight Initiative, which is a 3-year country program designed to assist Jamaica with eliminating violence against women and girls. It's funded jointly by the EU and the UN, and the program will address 3 priority areas: child sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, and discrimination against vulnerable groups. This focus provides a unique opportunity to address family violence as a major public health and development issue that has significant ramifications and impact at the individual, community, and national levels. Mr. Vice President, 4 key pieces of legislation intended to provide women and children with greater protection against domestic violence were also reviewed for strengthening by a special joint select committee, of which I was a member. The acts reviewed were the Sexual Offences Act, the Offences Against the Persons Act, the Domestic Violence Act, and the Child Care Protection Act. Special emphasis has been placed on the offences and punishment with regard to the murder of pregnant women, the assault of women, children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities, sexual offences and other violent crimes against women, persons with disabilities, and the elderly. The Joint Select Committee report was adopted in the House of Representatives in December 2019 and approved by the Senate in July 2020, based on which legislative amendments are now being worked on. I would wish to add, Mr. Vice President, that for those delegations which raise the issue of marital rape, one of the recommendations of the Joint Select Committee is certainly to remove all restrictions on prosecution of marital rape as an offense. The report of the first nationally led prevalence study on violence against women, the Women's Health Survey, was launched on the 22nd of June 2018 through partnership between UN Women and the Inter-American Development Bank in collaboration with the Statistical Institute of Jamaica. The survey provides the most current and nationally representative prevalence data. It seeks to address our data collection gap and thereby strengthen Jamaica's policy decision-making capacity. So, Vice President, the Sexual Harassment Prevention Act 2020 is currently under consideration by a Joint Select Committee of Parliament that was established in July 2019. The committee is continuing its work to debate and consider recommendations from oral and written submissions made by the public. To date, 10 written submissions have been received from 2 public sector entities, 7 NGOs, and 1 private individual. While the requisite legislation is yet to be adopted, we can report that given increased sensitization to the issue of sexual harassment, especially during the conduct of this committee, a number of entities that perform public functions have already developed workplace policies on this issue. Mr. Vice President, I will now speak to the matter of cooperation with special procedures. Jamaica regards special procedures mandate holders as constructive players in the international human rights framework and welcomes collaboration with these mandate holders. However, visits have to be in accordance with mutually agreed timelines as determined on a case-by-case basis. Jamaica has received official visits from UN Special Rapporteurs, albeit not recently, and we have, however, cooperated with another critical human rights body, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which held its 172nd period of sessions from the 3rd to the 10th of May 2019 in Kingston at the invitation of the government of Jamaica. In fact, this was the first such session being held in the Caribbean. The Commission in February 2019 also conducted a promotional visit throughout the Caribbean, including Jamaica, to promote the Commission's mandates, strengthen knowledge of the mechanisms for the protection and promotion of human rights in the inter-American system, and in a bid to strengthen dialogue with key actors working in the field of human rights. Mr. Vice President, I move to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights and access to sexual and reproductive health services. The Ministry of Health and Wellness and various stakeholders have collaborated to draft a sexual and reproductive health policy that addresses every age group and risk issue. This is being finalized for adoption. The ministry has increased its capacity to target adolescents through the Teen Hub, located in Kingston, which provides sexual and reproductive health advice, mental health counseling, and HIV testing and counseling. The hub recruits adolescents primarily through peer-to-peer referrals and is increasingly popular among male adolescents and the hearing impaired community. The hub's success has resulted in the planning of 2 additional hubs to be launched across the island. Mr. Vice President, I now turn to the critical issue of protection of children. The protection of vulnerable in our society, including our children, remains an area of prime focus for the government. The National Parenting Support Commission is an agency of the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, which seeks to assist parents in developing the skills they need to raise and protect their children. The work of the Commission has fostered a collaborative effort between home and school, whereby parents and teachers cooperate in the education of children. In April 2020, the Commission, in collaboration with UNICEF, the Victoria Mutual Foundation, and Fight for Peace, launched 36 helplines to assist parents who have expressed difficulty coping amid the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges of online schooling due to the non-resumption of in-person classes. There are 2 helplines in each of the 14 parishes, with the exception of Kingston, St. James, St. Anne, St. Catherine, and Clarendon, which due to size and prevalence of violence were given additional numbers. Likewise, the Child Protection and Family Services Agency, through its Public Relations and Communication Unit, activated its crisis communication protocol. Its contact numbers were publicized widely through Jamaica Information Service, social media pages, and mainstream media. A Child Protection Forum was held virtually in June 2020 with some 4,000 participants. Other initiatives undertaken to connect with children and to build their awareness to report child abuse during COVID-19 include weekly social media posts promoting the numbers to call to report child abuse. Kids Connect radio call-in program for children was launched, a partnership with a local radio station hosting a 4-week program targeting children and encouraging them to call in under the topics child protection, education, health, cyberbullying, and missing children. Media interviews were also undertaken in partnership with various media houses to participate in heightening awareness about how to report child abuse. Mr. Vice President, on the 19th of November 2020, the CPFSA will be executing a major public education program which will be aired on leading media, television, radio, and social media platforms. This will communicate to the nation the provisions of the National Plan of Action for an Integrated Response to Children and Violence, and the roles and responsibilities of all citizens to work to safeguard and protect children from violence and harm. This event will be held to mark the 1st anniversary of the launch of the National Plan and also to mark International Child Abuse Prevention Day. It is expected to reach an audience of at least 750,000 people. To increase accessibility of child-related services, the Office of the Children's Advocate has launched its #OCA-Do-Road initiative, under which certain communities with high-risk vulnerabilities for children have been targeted. And hotspot sessions will be conducted in a bid to engage children directly, identify specific needs, and provide any necessary support. In addition, infographics have been created with mobile telephone numbers at which an intake officer can be reached at any time for the purposes of receiving complaints about situations in which children require intervention and assistance. In addition, in 2018, the government established the National Steering Committee on Child Labor. The role of this multi-sectoral body is to provide leadership and guidance for the development of policies and programs aimed at eliminating child labor. Since the inception of this committee, significant strides have been made towards protecting our children. One gain, for example, has been the creation of non-hazardous work lists for children and the execution of capacity building sessions for diverse stakeholders on the issue of child labor. The CPFSA has also developed and provided mental health training for social workers and caregivers, in addition to a suite of programs being delivered under the Mental Health Services Project. This has resulted in 150 individuals from different levels of the CPFSA network of service partners being trained. The agency has also deployed its mobile mental health unit to provide psychosocial screening, assessment, and intervention for children in state care, with an emphasis on those being served in the residential child protection sector. Mr. Vice President, I will pause here with your leave to allow for further interventions by the recommending states. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Foreign Minister. We will now continue with our interactive dialogue, and I will give the floor to Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Trinidad and Tobago wishes to express its appreciation to our fellow Caribbean community member state, Jamaica, for the presentation of its 3rd cycle report, and applauds the government for its continued commitment to the promotion and protection of all human rights. It is evident that the protection of human rights and the rule of law remain a priority for Jamaica. Trinidad and Tobago notes the progress of Jamaica towards achieving its Vision 2030 National Development Plan and encourages the government to remain steadfast in its efforts to overcome any lingering development challenges. Jamaica is to be commended on its National Policy on Poverty and National Poverty Reduction Program, which address the issue of poverty through a coordinated approach. Mindful of the disastrous effects of climate change on small island developing states, Jamaica is to be congratulated for undertaking research to improve understanding of climate change impacts and support decision-making. Trinidad and Tobago encourages Jamaica to sustain its effort to improve public security, boost economic growth and environmental sustainability, and reduce the rate of chronic non-communicable diseases. Mr. Vice President, Trinidad and Tobago extends its best wishes to Jamaica for a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the members of the delegation of Jamaica. We thank them for the presentation of their national report. We take note of the efforts by the government to implement the recommendations that it received in the last cycle and the measures to achieve social development and combat poverty, gender-based violence, corruption, and organized crime. We also welcome Jamaica's cooperation with the United Nations human rights mechanisms, as well as the ratification of the Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers. We would like to recommend Jamaica to consider the possibility of establishing a national human rights institution in accordance with Paris principles. Second, continue efforts to promote the rule of law and to control violence and crime and prosecute perpetrators. Three, to continue efforts to adaptation and mitigation efforts to alleviate the effects of climate change on human rights.
Welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to this review and thanks them for their national report. We note that specific measures have been undertaken to implement the recommendations accepted at the last review, and in this regard, we commend the government for the enactment of the human rights protective legislation and policies. The national report highlights the devastating impact of climate change. We are pleased by the government's comprehensive approach to mitigate the environmental challenges of an island nation. We acknowledge the government's efforts to protect the rights of women and girls. However, we are convinced that more needs to be done and therefore recommend the following. Scale up measures to reduce the prevalence of gender-based violence. 2. Finalize the process of establishing a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris principles. We wish Jamaica a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Ukraine.
President, Ukraine welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and the country's adherence to the review process. We positively note the adoption and implementation of the National Development Plan Vision 2030, which provides a strategic roadmap to ensure broad-based improvement in the quality of life of all Jamaicans towards a secure and prosperous future. Ukraine recommends to Jamaica to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, aiming at abolition of death penalty, and at this stage to ensure that the death row regime does not amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Promptly accede to the International Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment and its optional protocol, and incorporate them into its national law. Accelerate the process of establishing a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris principles. Provide a legislative and regulatory framework to protect women from gender-based violence. Extend a standing invitation to all HRC special procedures and closely cooperate with them. We wish Jamaica a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom welcomes Jamaica's engagement with the UPR process and will recognise the progress made in the area of media freedom. However, we remain concerned by reports of abuses in the correctional system and the high rate of fatal shooting incidents involving the security services. We urge the government to continue to work to reduce fatal shooting incidents, including by strengthening the Independent Commission of Investigations and ensuring that the Jamaican correctional system adheres to international human rights standards. We recommend that Jamaica 1. Respond constructively to the anticipated Government Task Force report on the long-term incarceration of mentally ill people in Jamaican prisons and address the systematic failures identified by the Independent Commission on Investigations. 2. Improve effectiveness of victim identification and support for victims of human trafficking by developing victim-centred, trauma-informed procedures in law enforcement operations, investigations and criminal justice proceedings, and increase efforts to investigate, prosecute and convict traffickers. 3. Adopt a merit-based process to selecting national candidates for UN body elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to the United States of America.
The United States welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to the UPR Working Group. The United States recommends that Jamaica 1. End abuses by security forces and other government agents involved in extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, and life-threatening prison conditions, and ensure swift accountability for those who commit abuses by implementing existing mechanisms to investigate and punish abuses and by clearing administrative backlogs. 2. Combat trafficking in persons by increasing the number of trafficking victims annually identified and receiving services, and enforce accountability of suspected human trafficking offenders by increasing prosecutions and punishments. 3. Repeal the Offenses Against the Persons Act that criminalizes same-sex sexual activity between consenting adults. We are deeply concerned by the high rates of homicide and femicide in Jamaica and the government's insufficient response to end such violence and hold accountable those responsible. While we commend the efforts taken thus far to remedy the life-threatening conditions of Jamaica's prisons and detention centers, the government must continue to improve conditions and protect the human rights of those detained.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Vanuatu.
Thank you, Madam President. Vanuatu welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to this review and thanks for its comprehensive presentation. Vanuatu commends the government of Jamaica for accepting several recommendations to establish a national human rights institution and for being a voice in calling for measures to address the climate crisis. Vanuatu recommends Jamaica, first, to accede to the International Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment and its optional protocol. Second, to ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on 8 December 2017. We wish Jamaica every success at this review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Vice President. We welcome the Jamaican delegation and thank it for its presentation. We highlight ratification of ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers, as well as the country's timely reporting to human rights treaty bodies. In a constructive spirit, we have the following recommendations for the government: to establish a national human rights institution in line with the Paris Principles, carry out thorough investigations, prosecute and punish cases of torture, gender-based violence and violence against other vulnerable groups such as the LGBTI community, ensure access to justice and reparation for victims, take effective measures to reduce overcrowding in detention centres with non-custodial sentences, improve health conditions and access to medical care for inmates, ensure the physical integrity and safety of children and adolescents in juvenile centres, prohibit corporal punishment of children in all settings, and repeal exculpatory grounds in the law that endorse it, and ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR and abolish the death penalty. We wish you every success.
Thank you very much. Give the floor to Angola.
Thank you, Vice President. Angola welcomes the delegation of Jamaica. Its participation in this session is proof of the commitment of national authorities to the promotion and protection of human rights. Angola notes with appreciation Jamaica's efforts to achieve the SDGs, in particular with regard to eradication of poverty, strengthening justice and social peace, as well as reducing inequalities. Angola recommends Jamaica the following. 1. Strengthen national programs for the economic empowerment of women. 2. Take additional measures to regulate the use, possession, and acquisition of small arms, in particular with a view to reducing the number of illegally held weapons. 3. Continue to promote respect for and protection of human rights by strengthening policies for the social inclusion of young people through the practice of sport. Angola wishes Jamaica great success in this UPR. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, now give the floor to Argentina.
Argentina is pleased to highlight the appointment of a national rapporteur on trafficking in 2015 and the adoption of the National Action Plan to fight human trafficking for 2015 to 2018. We have the following recommendations for Jamaica. 1. Consider signing and ratifying the International Convention to protect all persons from enforced disappearance. 2. Adopt the necessary measures to decriminalise same-sex sexual relations between consenting adults and curb prejudice about homosexuality and social stigma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Madam President. Australia acknowledges Jamaica's progress in strengthening human rights and its improved Freedom House democracy score. We welcome progress and urge further action on measures to improve prison conditions and on security force-related killings as a result of excessive use of force. Australia is deeply concerned the death penalty remains part of the Jamaican legal framework. Gender-based violence in Jamaica is increasing, and we urge an accelerated, systematic approach in implementing the national strategy launched in 2017. We encourage further action to promote and protect the rights of LGBTI persons, including through legislative reform and engagement with initiatives such as the United Nations Free and Equal campaign. Australia recommends that Jamaica, 1. Abolish the death penalty and ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2. Expand resources for gender-based violence awareness campaigns, legal aid, shelters, and health, education and employment services for victims and survivors. 3. Decriminalise consensual same-sex relations. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Bahamas.
The Bahamas extends a warm welcome to the sister CARICOM delegation of Jamaica, thanks the country for its report, and commends the engagement in this UPR process. In a constructive spirit, the Bahamas recommends that Jamaica, 1. Ensures adequate resources are provided for implementation of its National Poverty Reduction Plan so as to sustain momentum and advance the plan's multifaceted approach. 2. Continues efforts to have all child diversion facilities fully operational in each parish by the end of November 2020, in keeping with the set goal. And 3. Strengthens the legislative, policy, and advocacy environment to address discrimination in access to HIV/AIDS treatment. We commend Jamaica for its progress in the field of human rights over the reporting period, including a number of initiatives to promote gender equality and eliminate gender-based violence, as well as to promote and protect children's rights. Ongoing efforts to strengthen the national climate change policy framework are also most welcome. As a fellow small island developing state, we recognize the challenges faced by Jamaica, including due to limited resources and the disproportionate threats posed by climate change. We therefore encourage Jamaica to avail itself of technical assistance and capacity building support in accordance with its human rights priorities and call on the international community to cooperate with the country in this regard. We wish Jamaica every success in this UPR process. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Barbados.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Barbados welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and commends its engagement in the UPR process. We appreciate the updates provided in the national report here today and what is being done by the government of Jamaica to promote the enjoyment of human rights by all. We know that Jamaica has consistently taken steps to bring its reports up to date, and is currently working to complete outstanding reports. We commend the efforts made to improve its reporting procedures and compliance. The establishment of the Interministerial Committee on Human Rights will no doubt aid in facilitating dialogue among stakeholders, including civil society representatives, on the implementation of obligations under various human rights treaties. Barbados recommends that Jamaica, 1, continue to employ a multi-sectoral approach centered on human rights principles to address and eventually eliminate gender-based violence. 2, deepen efforts to address extreme poverty and psychosocial needs, especially given the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. And 3, enhance programs that bring support to children in conflict with the law by diverting them from the formal system of justice. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Botswana.
Madam President, Botswana warmly welcomes the delegation of the Republic of Jamaica to the third cycle of the UPR process. We thank the delegation for the presentation of their comprehensive national report and further updates provided today. We note that our recommendation made during the last UPR for Jamaica to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and accede to the agreement on the privileges and immunities of the International Criminal Court has been well received. We commend Jamaica for the consistent up-to-date reporting on its commitment under various human rights treaties and other UN treaty bodies, as indicated in their national report. We encourage continued compliance with these obligations. Despite resource constraints, Botswana makes the following 2 recommendations to Jamaica. 1, provide island-wide access to safe places for victims of gender-based violence, especially to women and children, by allocating adequate resources to increase the number of institutions that provide support and shelters for victims of gender-based violence. And 2, undertake a holistic review of legislation with a view to eliminating or reforming laws that prevent different forms of direct or indirect discrimination against women. We wish Jamaica a successful review outcome. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Brazil.
Brazil welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to the third cycle of the UPR and, in a constructive spirit, wishes to make the following recommendations. 1. Update legislation in line with international law aiming at ensuring equal protection and access to justice to all women victims of sexual violence. And 2. Take measures to ensure adequate treatment to people living with HIV/AIDS and to protect people from discrimination based on health status. We commend Jamaica's willingness to cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms, as well as its commitment to protect individual freedoms, such as the freedom of expression, freedom of press, and the freedom of religion. We acknowledge Jamaica's efforts to lower crime rates, boost sustainable development, and reduce the rate of chronic, non-communicable diseases. We note with appreciation the current implementation of the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence. We encourage the Jamaican state to strengthen its fight against child labor and sexual harassment. Finally, Brazil welcomes the Jamaican government's willingness to establish a national human rights institution and wishes Jamaica a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Canada.
Canada welcomes the positive steps taken by Jamaica since its last review, including the launch of a 10-year National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence in 2018. Canada recommends that Jamaica, 1, strengthen efforts to eliminate gender-based violence and gender discrimination through legislative measures, policies, and educational programs. 2, repeal legislation criminalizing consensual same-sex practices between adults and strengthen the legal framework to combat discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. 3, amend the INDECOM Act based on recommendations made by the Joint Select Committee of Parliament in 2015 to give the Independent Commission on Investigations the mandate and concrete capabilities to arrest, charge, and prosecute members of the security forces with unlawful killings and abuses of power. 4, sign and ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Canada applauds Jamaica's continued exemplary diligence regarding press freedom, and we urge the government of Jamaica to expedite the establishment of a fully mandated and independent national human rights institution. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Chile.
Madam President, I'd like to thank the delegation of Jamaica for the presentation of the national report. We recognize the progress achieved by Jamaica in the area of gender, especially the creation of a national strategic action plan to eliminate gender-based violence 2017-2017 and the establishment of an advisory council on gender in 2018. We also praise the efforts taken to create a National Institute for Human Rights, and we encourage Jamaica to step up its efforts in order to ensure that you can enjoy having an institute that is guided by the Paris Principles. Chile would like to respectfully recommend the following. Move forward in the ratification of the Convention Against Torture and also the optional protocol and the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. Step up effort to combat any forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls, and review legal procedures in order to ensure that victims of domestic violence can have adequate access to the judiciary system. And third, prohibit legally discrimination on the basis of gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and punish all forms of violence against LGBTI persons. We wish Jamaica full success.
I'll give the floor to China.
Mr. Vice President, the Chinese delegation thanks Jamaica for its national report. We commend Jamaica's efforts and progress in promoting and protecting human rights. In particular, the formulation of a national development plan, Jamaica Vision 2030, to promote economic and social development, to reduce poverty, to develop education and health services, to combat human trafficking, and to protect the rights of vulnerable groups such as women, children, and persons with disabilities. We would like to make two recommendations to Jamaica. First, to continue to promote sustainable economic and social development, improve people's living standards, and provide a solid foundation for the enjoyment of all human rights by its people. The second, to continue to promote gender equality and further protect the rights of women and children. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Very much. I'll give the floor to Cuba.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Cuba would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Jamaica and thank the delegation for the presentation of the national report. We'd like to recommend the following. First, strengthen the scope and the impact of the national program for poverty reduction, paying special attention to sectors as rural women and persons with disabilities, and include in this program the response to the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. 2, continue implementing the policy on sexual health and reproductive health, focusing on actions with adolescents and young people, with special attention to questions of prevention and dealing with sexually transmitted diseases. We praise the progressive implementation of the National Strategic Plan to Eliminate Gender-Based Violence 2017-2027, and also the improvement of measures of prevention and dealing with trafficking. We recognize the commitment of the country and wish full success to Jamaica in this process.
I'll now give the floor back to Her Excellency Foreign Minister Smith to address the observation and comments made so far.
Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegations, again, I extend my appreciation to all states that have offered recommendations. The government of Jamaica values the views provided, and we equally value the opportunity for dialogue. I now refer to the establishment of the National Human Rights Institute, the NHRI, and National Mechanism for Implementation, Reporting, and Follow-up. The establishment of such an institution, the NHRI, remains an important objective of the government of Jamaica. The government, collaborating with various public and private stakeholders, has studied various models of NHRIs with a view to determining the best approach for Jamaica. The proposed model has to amalgamate, adjust, and expand roles and functions, as there are currently multiple institutions in Jamaica that already work towards protecting human rights. The proposals to be submitted to Cabinet for further consideration at an appropriate time will also have to address the issue of increased financial undertakings and implications for our budget, as well as the structure of the institution, with a view to determining the best allocation of human and financial resources. I must emphasize that while a National Human Rights Institute is yet to be established, there are various mechanisms and processes in place to facilitate Jamaica in meeting its human rights obligations. Mr. Vice President, in relation to questions related to equality and non-discrimination, I must reiterate that the Jamaican Constitution provides for the respect of the rights of all persons without distinction. Likewise, all persons are afforded equality before the law. As such, the government of Jamaica is opposed to violence and discrimination against any group of persons. In conjunction with the human rights guaranteed in the Constitution, Jamaica has taken measures to mitigate against any form of discrimination. For instance, there is a diversity policy for the Jamaica Constabulary Force that was promulgated on the 26th of August, 2011. The policy gives guidance to police officers as to how to fairly protect the rights of all persons, including members of the LGBTI community. The objectives of the policy include fostering public confidence by demonstrating fairness, integrity, tolerance, and understanding in dealing with all sectors of the community. It seeks to achieve a demonstration of commitment, value, and support to every individual by seeking to eliminate all forms of harassment and unfair bias, to provide the necessary support and referral to victims of crime and violence, regardless of affiliation, whether individual or group of the particular complainant, to eliminate the fear of individuals from diverse groups of reporting crime and violence, and to ensure the provision of high-quality professional policing services to all members of the public. Additionally, the Jamaica National Integrated Strategic Plan for Sexual and Reproductive Health and HIV 2014 to 2019 identifies an enabling environment and human rights as one of the strategic priorities pursued by the Ministry of Health and Wellness. The plan notes in particular that stigma and discrimination towards people living with HIV and their families and men who have sex with men may adversely affect testing, uptake of HIV services, adherence to antiretroviral treatment, and access to supportive services. The government, through that ministry, has undertaken in very practical ways to pursue interventions targeting individuals, communities, and institutions to address stigma and discrimination. Jamaica also regularly participates in the UN program on HIV/AIDS in the preparation of the Global AIDS Monitoring Report and the National Commitments and Policy Instrument. Both reports involve Jamaica reporting on the measures it has taken to combat HIV/AIDS, especially among vulnerable populations, such as men who have sex with men. These reports are prepared in collaboration with relevant civil society organizations. Mr. Vice President, on the right to life, liberty, and security of persons, the protection of human rights and the rule of law remain a priority for the government of Jamaica, as is evidenced by the initiatives undertaken thus far. The government, through the Ministry of National Security, has implemented a national CCTV surveillance system, the Jamaica Eye, to seek to enhance citizen security broadly. During the period under review, the replacement of old and dysfunctional cameras originally installed almost 10 years ago in some towns, that the replacement has been completed, and the number of cameras covering major cities and towns has more than doubled. Jamaica has commenced the implementation of a strategic security and development program called Plan Secure Jamaica. The plan's broad strategic outcomes and objectives are to deter or otherwise prevent threats, to build robustness and resilience to protect against the effects of threats and hazards, to strengthen Jamaica's capabilities to appropriately and effectively respond to many and varied threats to Jamaica's security. The Citizen Security Program is a multi-sectoral, community-focused thematic component of the broad-based strategic plan. It's aimed at improving citizen security and new interventions that have been deemed necessary to strengthen the approach to improving citizen security. The prioritized outcomes of this program are categorized into 3 focus areas to be implemented in 21 at-risk communities utilizing the clear hold-build approach. A crime monitoring oversight committee has also been created as the governance mechanism, which functions as an independent body, bringing together non-partisan stakeholders from the private sector, civil society, academia, and the political directorate. The Law Reform, Zones of Special Operations, Special Security and Community Development Measures Act 2017 mandates the provision of consistent training in human rights, use of force, and community development initiatives to the Jamaica Defense Force and the Jamaica Constabulary Force officers who oversee these operations. This is in addition to the human rights training that is already given to members of our security forces. The framework is also based on a strong social and community development program to train, reintegrate, empower, and build community cohesion to buttress security efforts by providing social services to vulnerable communities. There are currently 4 zones of special operation in operation at this time. In respect of aspects which prevent abuse by law enforcement, the Act also requires that whenever a search of any place or vehicle is conducted, the owner, possessor, or occupier must be in attendance and must have the opportunity to observe the search. It prohibits the seizure of any tool of lawful trade or business or any document subject to legal professional privilege. Furthermore, arrests are prohibited unless there are reasonable grounds. At the time of arrest, people are entitled to know immediately the basis of their arrest and to be brought forthwith before a justice of the peace. Justices of the peace are required to determine whether there are reasonable grounds for detention. Reports are made routinely to Parliament on the operations of the zones of special operations. Furthermore, any person who is detained is entitled to have access to his or her legal counsel, physician, spouse or partner, family member, or religious counselor. He or she is also entitled to receive items of food and clothing or other such article as necessary in the interest of his or her health and well-being while detained. As part of enabling transparency, members of the security forces who operate in zones of special operation must use body-worn cameras where possible and given available resources. Importantly, persons who are detained during any state of public emergency, a different regime, are entitled to have their detention reviewed by the Emergency Powers Review Tribunal, and the tribunal is established as one of the very first steps on institution of a state of emergency. A request for a review of legality or reasonableness of detention may be made every 6 weeks spent in detention. And furthermore, the Emergency Powers Review Tribunal has the power to issue legally binding instructions to the detaining authority. Moreover, for each state of emergency that is declared, emergency powers regulations are also promulgated. These regulations prohibit, among other things, abuse, insults, threats, or the assault of any person with a view to deterring such persons from carrying out any lawful act. There is, Mr. President, greater use of technology and intelligence, collection, collation, synthesis, sharing, and use in our efforts against crime. In addition, there's also greater use of technology in investigation, which includes use of DNA, ballistics, and forensics evidence. Greater focus is also placed on an increase in high visibility policing in communities, public safety, community-based policing specifically, and stakeholder engagement. In regards to the appeal of cases by the government, specifically relating to the detention of persons under the state of emergency, as was asked, the government of Jamaica, as a policy, does not discuss matters while they are before the court. Pleadings in court and hearing dates on cases, however, are matters of public record and can therefore be easily accessed at appropriate times. In addition to investigation, efforts are continuing to strengthen the prosecutorial arm of the justice system to make it more efficient and effective. On another point, Mr. Vice President, in 2019, the Ministry of National Security launched a project to rebuild, overhaul, and construct, targeting over 200 police facilities island-wide. The objective of Project ROC is to convert all police stations into modern, citizen-friendly workspaces, provide officers with comfortable environments conducive to work, while creating an ambience for citizens to willingly and comfortably engage the police. Increased reporting of crime by vulnerable victims specifically is hoped to be one of the benefits of these improvements, which include rooms to provide privacy in reporting on sensitive issues such as domestic violence or violence against vulnerable communities. Mr. Vice President, I will now address the issue of persons in detention, including persons with mental disabilities. Most mentally challenged inmates have been abandoned by their relatives. The government of Jamaica continues to be committed to ensuring that the rights of all inmates, especially the vulnerable, including the mentally ill, are assured. A joint approach between the Ministries of National Security, Justice, and Health and Wellness has begun with policy discussions with an aim to have a coordinated plan to treat with this issue. The first step taken thus far is an audit of the system to review the systems and procedures and to identify specific gaps. The next step will be an action plan to operationalize ways to address the notable gaps. A project was undertaken by our legal aid, National Legal Aid Program, which has addressed the detention of several mentally ill persons who had been detained for inordinate periods. Since the INDECOM investigations regarding mentally challenged inmates who are in the custody of the Department of Correctional Services took place, the engagement with relevant stakeholders has intensified. It should be noted, however, that the DCS only houses these persons and provides evaluations to the courts. The JCF also has very clear policy guidelines as to how to deal with persons with mental health who are taken into custody. Mentally challenged inmates are vulnerable and are therefore not placed within the general population. Based on their condition, they are placed at a different location from all other inmates, and this location was recently refurbished. The need to construct a modern correctional facility has been considered, and currently the process of reviewing proposals for the design of such is on track. In the interim, the DCS team is committed and trained to do what is required to ensure that inmates' rights and dignity are safeguarded and their general sense of humanity is maintained while incarcerated within correctional facilities. Mr. Vice President, I conclude by reiterating that Jamaica and the Jamaican government remain fully committed to the implementation of the recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review. We will endeavor to uphold our demonstrated tradition of respect for the rule of law and indeed human rights of all forms. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We'll now continue with our interactive dialogue, and I'll give the floor to Denmark.
Madam President, Denmark welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and thanks it for its presentation. Denmark commends Jamaica's progress in the protection and promotion of human rights since its last EUPR. We stress in this regard the importance of national human rights institutions to uphold and ensure continued progress. Therefore, Denmark recommends the government to establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principle. While recognizing some improvements relating to women's rights, Denmark remains concerned about the inadequate protection of the LGBTI community. Denmark recommends the government to decriminalize same-sex sexual acts and enact protective legislation for LGBTI persons. Finally, Denmark recommends the government to ratify the Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol. Allow me in this context to highlight that the Convention Against Torture initiative stands ready to explore avenues to assist Jamaica in advancing on this issue if deemed helpful. Denmark wishes Jamaica a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Dominican Republic.
Señor Vicepresidente. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. The Dominican Republic welcomes the distinguished delegation of Jamaica. The Dominican Republic highlights the efforts taken by Jamaica to reduce poverty through the National Program on Poverty Reduction. Also, we praise the action programs developed by Jamaica to mitigate the effects of climate change. Respectfully, we would like to make the following recommendations. First, continue the efforts taken aimed at reducing poverty and increase social programs aimed at improving the living conditions of the population. Two, take measures to strengthen the protection of persons with HIV/AIDS and deal with the discrimination against this group of the population in all forms. Third, continue to implement effective policies to mitigate the impact of climate change. We wish Jamaica success in this UPR. Thank you.
Floor to Ecuador.
Mr. President, thank you. Ecuador would like to extend a warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of Jamaica and thank the delegation for the report. Ecuador recognizes the progress achieved since the previous UPR cycle, among others, the creation of a national group to combat trafficking in human beings. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, we would like to make the following recommendations. First, accept the recommendation on the creation of the National Human Rights Institution in the country. Two, include fully in national legislation the norms included international instruments on human rights. Three, adopt the necessary measures to the full implementation of the law on persons with disabilities of 2014 and implement policies and programs to guarantee the rights of persons with disabilities. Ecuador wishes full success to the delegation of Jamaica during this UPR.
Very much. I'll give the floor to Fiji.
Fiji welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and congratulates the delegation for the achievements in the implementation of the recommendations from its previous cycle. Fiji commends Jamaica for its efforts in the advancement of its climate change agenda at the national level through a number of policy initiatives, as well as through the implementation of strategic adaptation, mitigation, and resilience building projects and programs. Fiji also commends Jamaica for its commitment to addressing gender-based violence and its ongoing legal reforms on gender equality. Fiji offers Jamaica the following recommendations. 1. Ensure that women, children, persons with disabilities, and indigenous and local communities are meaningfully engaged in the development and implementation of climate change and disaster risk reduction policies. 2. Strengthen efforts to eliminate discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity, actual or perceived, in compliance with its human rights obligations. 3. Consider abolishing the death penalty. And 4. Consider ratifying the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. We wish the delegation every success in its review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to France.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. France thanks Jamaica for the presentation of the report. France invites the authorities of the country to continue efforts in the area of human rights and would like to make the following recommendations. First, declare a moratorium on executions with a view on the definitive abolition of the death penalty for all crimes. Ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC, the Convention Against all forms of torture, and the International Convention on Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. Fights against impunity and support any initiative in order to improve the crime resolution rates and improve the timeframes for handling of criminal cases. 4, fight against extreme poverty and guarantee access to health services and to education. 5, take all measures to guarantee the protection of LGBTI persons and put an end to discrimination against this group. Full success to Jamaica. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Georgia welcomes the delegation of Jamaica and thanks the head of delegation for the presentation of the national report. Georgia notes with appreciation measures introduced by the government of Jamaica aimed at improving the promotion and protection of human rights within the current review cycle. Georgia welcomes the efforts by the government to achieve gender equality as well as implementing the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based and sexual violence. Georgia also welcomes improved measures to protect the right of the child, including the launching the global partnership to end violence against children. With this, we recommend the government of Jamaica: 1. Take further steps towards establishment of national human rights institution. 2. Continue its efforts to ensure that persons living with and affected by HIV can access treatment, care and support services without fear of discrimination. We wish the delegation of Jamaica successful UPR.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Germany.
Germany welcomes the delegation of Jamaica to this UPR. We commend Jamaica for its efforts to tackle sexual and gender-based violence, as outlined in the National Strategic Action Plan, and for the reduction of the number of deaths by use of firearms by security forces. However, Germany remains concerned about the rights of vulnerable groups, especially children and LGBTs, and would like to encourage Jamaica to take steps towards the abolition of the death penalty. Therefore, Germany would like to offer the following recommendations. First, establish an independent national human rights institution and provide it with a full mandate and independence in line with the Paris principles. Second, draft and adopt legislative measures and take practical steps to prohibit corporal punishment of children in all settings. Third, ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. Fourth, ensure that cases of violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender persons are thoroughly investigated, that the convicted perpetrators are prosecuted and, if convicted, punished with appropriate sanctions, and that the victims have access to effective remedies. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this was the last speaker on our list. I now give the floor back to Her Excellency Foreign Minister Johnson-Smith to address the observation and the comments and to make her final remarks. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Vice President and delegations. The government remains resolute in its commitment to promoting and upholding respect for human rights, which it believes to be universal, inalienable, indivisible, and interdependent, in adherence to its constitutional, regional, and international obligations, and in accordance with the principles of democracy and the rule of law. Jamaica has made significant strides in implementing the accepted recommendations from the previous two cycles, and we continue to actively bolster existing mechanisms for the protection and advancement of the rights of every citizen, especially the most vulnerable. We continue to strive to ensure the full promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Jamaicans and migrants without distinction, in keeping with the provisions of the Jamaican Constitution. In that regard, and as evidenced in the national report, as well as my previous presentations to this working group, the government has been tireless in its efforts to further strengthen the legal, policy, and institutional architecture at the national level. In terms of our national policy on poverty, a national policy on poverty and national poverty reduction program were approved by the government in September 2017 as a strategic response to addressing the issue of poverty through a coordinated, holistic approach. The policy and programmatic framework are recognized as contributory elements to the overall effort of the government to strengthen and support economic growth and broader social and sustainable development outcomes. Jamaica has been, however, hard hit by the crisis, with the economy now grappling the challenges of reduced revenues, increased health and social expenditures, a reversal of debt reduction targets, and an ongoing climate crisis, which threatened to undo years of hard-won development gains. The The government of Jamaica stands ready and unwavering in its resolve to fulfill its obligations and to continue its cooperation with the UN human rights mechanism, including treaty bodies, as well as with its regional and bilateral partners in the field of human rights. In addition, we will also be facilitating ongoing engagement with civil society and other relevant stakeholders, including through the Interministerial Committee on Human Rights, led by this ministry. Mr. Vice President, in closing, I must express our gratitude on behalf of the government of Jamaica and my delegation to all participating delegations for their active and constructive engagement in this third Universal Periodic Review of Jamaica. Bearing in mind Jamaica's firm commitment to the promotion of human rights, the government has welcomed the process. I thank the distinguished members of the Troika, the Republic of Fiji, the Republic of Venezuela, and the Republic of Angola. Further, our sincere appreciation goes to the UPR and OHCHR secretariats for their contribution to the process thus far. Mr. Vice President, I also commend you for the way in which you so ably guided our session today. Distinguished delegations, ladies and gentlemen, and Mr. Vice President, I thank you all.
Thank you very much. I would like to also thank Her Excellency and the delegation for the presentation and participation in this review. The report of the review will be prepared by the members of the Troika, namely representatives of Angola, Fiji, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. In accordance with the procedure implemented in 2015, the recommendation section will be distributed in the afternoon of Friday, 13th of November, for the adoption on the same day as from 3:30 p.m. The full report, including the summary section, will be circulated by email on Friday, 20th of November, 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our meeting. We will reconvene on Friday, 13th of November at 3:30 p.m. for the adoption of the recommendations section of the draft reports of the UPR of Marshall Islands, the United States of America, Croatia, Libya, and Jamaica. The meeting is hereby closed.
Are you Oliver?